Thanks, Marissa. I'm pleased to welcome Aurora Harshner from Polychain Capital. Aurora will be talking to us about effective collaboration with hiring managers in a remote work environment. I know this is an important topic to many of you here today, and I look forward to hearing from what Aurora has to share with us. Aurora, thanks for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit about my experience working with remote hiring managers, and hopefully you can take away some helpful tips from today. So I'd like to start with a little bit about me and my background. So I've been in HR and hiring for actually about 14 years, and 10 of those years have been in an environment where I had the opportunity to do some sort of remote hiring. As you can see here, I worked at Airbnb, Coinbase, and I'm currently at Polychain Capital. All three of those places did extensive hiring at an international level. So what I'd like to walk through are basically why this has become, why the remote hiring aspect has become so important recently. With Polychain Capital, I work in a post-investment support where I work with a variety of different companies from around the world, and I teach them how to hire. Now, with what's unique to Polychain is we're a crypto native venture capital firm. So basically we invest in companies in the crypto and blockchain space. Now, because that is a decentralized technology, as a result, a lot of the teams decide to be decentralized themselves, which means that we have hiring from all over the world. So I've been working with these teams that have been dealing with these challenges for quite some time. But in the last 6 months, the rest of the world has been thrown into a pandemic and has had to very quickly adapt to remote hiring as well. So I want to talk through some of the things that you might think about that are really different from how you usually do business when you're in the office. For one, communication is really different. You are dealing with different tools, you have different teams have different expectations, and it's just important to take that into consideration when you're setting up working with a remote hiring team. It's also important to think about the fact that people are busy. I feel like now more than ever, people are working around the clock because there's not a lot else to do. And so calendars are packed, and you have to be mindful of scheduling and ensuring you get on calendars so that you can have meaningful conversations with the teams. You have time zones to take into account. So with our teams, we're sometimes working, a difference between 3, 5, 9, sometimes even more hours of difference. And unless you have already thought about connecting with these teams ahead of time, it can be really tricky to find that time to connect where there's overlap. And then lastly, this lack of collaboration, if you don't succeed in connecting with the teams regularly, leads to miscommunication, potential mishires, which can be really detrimental, and overall just lost time. So I want to talk through a few different tips that I'm hoping you can take away that will really help you as you all look to working better and partnering better with hiring managers. The first one is communication. So a few of my favorite things that I do and always have done with remote hiring is just setting up a weekly sync with my hiring teams. When I was working for Airbnb, I did a lot of hiring all over Europe and South America. So I had hiring managers in Denmark, in Brazil, in Paris, in Spain, and we always had to set up a weekly meeting that we knew once a week we were going to have a time to circle up together and talk about feedback, calibrate on the role, but we could ensure that we would have a good chunk of time that was on everybody's calendars to discuss everything. Now, in between those weekly syncs, it really works well to have asynchronous communication. And that can look like whatever tools you use. So I use Slack a lot. Also, one of my favorites is to use a Google Doc. Mostly it's free, everybody knows how to use it, and it's really easy collaboration tool. And I'll use the Google Doc in addition to the ATS, just so there's a place where you can record quick notes, everybody has access. And also, when you're sourcing with candidates and calibrating on what type of profile you should be looking for, it's a great way to get quick feedback from the hiring managers around if you're on the right track with just a basic grading system like A, B, C, D, etc. Now, I think another thing to really set you up for success is talk to your hiring teams, figure out what they use. Some teams may use Slack, some others might not. Some love Asana, some don't. And if you adjust your own style to whatever the team is used to using, you're going to have a significantly higher level of buy-in, and that will lead to better collaboration overall. The next tip is building trust. I think this is one of the most important aspects as a recruiter, because you've probably heard this before, but recruiters should be partners to hiring managers, not a service organization. And I think if you actually develop that relationship of trust early on, That will really help you to develop that partnership. But how do you develop trust quickly when you've never met them in person? Maybe you have, but maybe you haven't, right? Either way, there are a few different things that you can do to help build that trust early on. So the first is to really ask questions. It's hard to know exactly what to help people on if you don't have a clear idea of what sort of challenges they're facing. So understand what sort of obstacles they're facing, and then maybe teach them something. Help them understand something that you know that they might not understand. You're a recruiter. You've been doing recruiting for a long time, and so you are the expert, hands down. Now, you want to use that expertise and teach them some of these things that recruiters might take for granted. For example, we do Boolean searches all day long. We may do X-ray searches all day long, but those are things that hiring teams have never done before, and it will blow their mind if you teach them. And also, another fun fact is that if you teach people something, it actually deepens that level of trust, and they believe that you know what you're talking about. And they'll come to see you more as a partner rather than a service organization. Now, another thing that I love doing is providing data and tools before they ask. This is a pretty easy win. And at Polychain, where I'm working with a variety of different companies, I have access to compensation data, and I can just give it to them very quickly. And this will help them to make more competitive offers, but also it will help them to make sure that as they build their organizations, they're keeping fairness and equality in mind and ensuring they're not setting themselves up with problems of inequity down the line. Now, the last thing that I love doing, which is an easy win, is just making sure that I'm really respectful of their time. As we talked about, everybody's really busy, and running really efficient meetings and making sure that you provide clear follow-ups is a great way to show that you respect their time. And this can look just as simple as including a basic agenda in the invite so that everybody's clear on what you're going to talk about, as well as following up after the invite with any sort of details, helpful tips, and action items that you discussed during the meeting. The next tip is to sell the mission. This is probably one of the most common mistakes that I see founders make. And it basically is because they are incredibly technical most of the time, right? And they live in their world where they're focused at a deep technical level. And so when they try to talk about their product, they talk about the product as if they were speaking with one of their other engineers. Now, the problem with that is that it tends to be a little too technical. So a founder may think that creating an interoperable protocol is very normal and everybody should know what that is. But the reality is a lot of people don't know what that is. And so you need, before you even start hiring, sit down with your hiring managers, whether that's a founder or the hiring managers beneath them, and understand what is the story you're trying to tell? What is the mission? And also think about, is this mission inspiring or is it too technical? And is it a quick elevator pitch that you can give to a candidate quickly and doesn't take too long? Another thing that I find really helpful when I'm selling is to use analogies. But again, it's really important that those analogies are consistent across the board, and the entire hiring team is selling the same story, telling the same story, and using the same analogies. And I'll give you an example. So when I joined Airbnb in 2011, nobody thought staying in some stranger's room was cool. They all thought it was weird. And so, believe it or not, it was hard to convince people to come and join the company. But when I started telling the story as Airbnb is a company that could disrupt the entire hospitality industry, which is a $500 billion industry. And so even if we were to capture 1% of that, that would be a $5 billion business. Those are the analogies that I'm talking about, that it makes candidates kind of stop and think, wow, that's actually pretty meaningful. And if the entire hiring team is consistent with those, it just tells a really beautiful, cohesive story. And as I've alluded to a few times, the last piece here is just to ensure that everybody on the hiring team is aligned. This can be done pretty quickly. Once you come up with the mission and you and the hiring manager are aligned, just do a quick training with everybody and make sure that the entire team has the resources that you do in order to have those ready whenever a candidate asks. The fourth tip is addressing concerns around remote hiring. Now, it's a little scary to make hires when you haven't met somebody in person. I completely get it. I've had to do it for my own team. And I think there are a few things that you can help the hiring managers do that will address these concerns. So the first aspect is using structured interviews. This piece is really important for a variety of different reasons, but especially when you're remote, you really need to ensure that you have consistency and that structure to the interview so that it's very clear exactly what process you should follow every single time. Now, this can be in the form of a technical interview and that you ask a programming algorithmic question followed by an architecture question every single time. That way you're making sure that you're getting clear answers and you're asking the same questions across many candidates, and therefore the best answers stand out. But in addition to that, it's really important when you're asking any sort of cultural interviews, which is the key place where unconscious bias can creep in. Unconscious bias basically is where people have bias because just of their life experience. And when you are hiring for culture, I think sometimes people will hire with their gut, which can be a really dangerous thing because people tend to hire just people that are similar to themselves when they're hiring with their gut. And so by adding a very structured interview, for example, if you have culture questions, come up with, or values that you're interviewing for, come up with very specific questions on how to evaluate for those values, and then make sure that you have very clear answers, and then train people who are interviewing on what a great answer is versus a bad answer. And then be really consistent with those questions you're asking. If you ask the same 4 questions around culture every single time to 100 candidates, the clear best answers are going to stand out regardless of if you really like the person or not. Now, another thing that is very important to get hiring managers on board is to make sure that they have meaningful time with the candidate. So this could come in the form of something like a work trial or a pair programming session. I've done work trials with Airbnb and Coinbase and currently do them at Polychain. And this can look like anything from working with the candidate for 2 weeks to 1 week, 3 days, or sometimes even only 2 days. A pairing session is a good alternative, which is a little bit shorter, but still gives the optionality of sitting down and collaborating with the candidate. A candidate can pretty much fake it for an hour at any point, right? But it's very challenging to fake collaboration when you're sitting down and you need to demonstrate your ability to be creative, your ability to be resourceful and persevere through a challenging problem that might come up in some sort of pairing session or during a work trial. And if you can spend more time with the candidate, both the candidate as well as the hiring team are going to get a lot more signal on if this is the right fit, even if you've never officially met the candidate in person. Now, this is a lot of time, there's no question. And I think this is probably the number one response that I've gotten when I've presented this to teams is, well, I don't know if we have the time to do this. And what I might ask you or ask a hiring manager is, how much time does it take if you make a bad hire? Statistically, it actually takes about 80% of a manager's time in order to manage a bad hire out, which is not fun and a lot of work. But in addition to that, think about how much time it takes when you add up the hiring managers, the engineers, the recruiters, everybody who's interviewing these candidates, how much time and therefore money is going into the process of hiring these folks. And you really want to get it right. So if you do a work trial or just a pair programming session, it's significantly more signal and it really is worth it. Now, the last thing that can help hiring managers get comfortable with remote hiring is to do both front door as well as back channel references. So front door references are fairly straightforward. You ask the candidate for their references. I like to ask for 360-degree references, especially if they're a hiring manager, somebody who reported to them, was a peer, as well as somebody who managed them. Now, back channel references are references that you get from somebody other than the reference that the candidate gave you, because presumably they're going to give you references that are only going to say good things about them. I try to only hire after getting a back channel reference. With that said, it can be a little bit risky and you need to be very careful to be sure that you trust the person you're speaking with and they're not going to compromise the candidate's confidentiality. If I will leverage my network as well as the people that I work with in order to try to find somebody that I really trust and have a back channel conversation. Now, if you can't get a back channel reference safely, I would suggest not doing it because you definitely don't want to compromise the candidate's confidentiality. The 5th tip is always be closing. This is pretty much recruiting 101 for most recruiters, but surprisingly, a lot of hiring managers do not realize this. And in my job now where I teach hiring managers how to build their own teams, I do a lot of training on closing. But I think it's still very helpful from a recruiting standpoint just to have a nice little checklist. So I've listed out a few of my favorite questions that I ask in the first call. If you ask these already, great, you're doing great. If you don't, maybe add these to your repertoire so that you can just get more information up front. Now, with closing, this is really important because if you wait until the last conversation to have a discussion around closing, you're giving up all of your leverage. You're kind of flying in blind, which is a really scary thing. You should have a pretty good idea of how the candidate is feeling before you even go into a compensation conversation. Now, I think that if you ask these questions, such as, what made you respond? Why are you exploring new roles? Why are you even talking to me? Why was my messaging interesting? What's your timeline? Or who's really behind the decision? Is it you or is it your parents? Can be nicer about it, but I find often with new grads, their parents weigh in pretty heavily with their decision-making process. And it's important for you to know that, because in the close, if you are going up against another company that is maybe larger and more established, you do need to make sure that you're having the conversation with the right person. And I have, in many cases, actually hopped on phone calls with parents or aunts or uncles to have discussions as well, so they can get comfortable with the idea as well of hiring, for example, with Coinbase, which is a crypto company, which for a long time, and probably still today, a lot of parents think is a little bit sketchy, even though it's not. And then, of course, you definitely want to touch upon comp expectations. Now, I think a lot of people are a little nervous talking about comp, which is completely understandable, but it's really important to get some sort of baseline. And so a few creative tips that I would give you if you ask for comp expectations and the candidate just won't give it to you is to quote a range that's a little lower than what you actually have approved. That way you get a reaction one way or the other. This is the first conversation. And so if the candidate responds and says, oh, that's a lot lower than I was expecting, you can always resort back to, well, we haven't interviewed you yet, but once we do, if you do really well in the process, then I'll have what I need in order to go to bat for you. And we're willing to get creative for top candidates, and we will pay competitively. But at least you'll now know that the range you quoted was too low. And in some cases, they'll just come out and tell you exactly what their expectations are. Now, tip number 6, keep your data clean. Data is not super sexy, but it is incredibly important to doing your job well. I think that, just tracking goals to see how you're trending is incredibly important, especially if you're trying to collaborate remotely with hiring managers. I have worked with a lot of engineering managers in my day, and I think my experience working at Coinbase, which is deeply an engineering culture, really ingrained in my mind that you have to lead with data, otherwise nobody will believe you and nobody will do anything about it. So I think it's very important to keep good data and good just hygiene as you're navigating candidates through the ATS, because one of the key areas that can be very helpful is looking into the funnel data with your hiring managers to troubleshoot what's going on, especially when you're remote and you can't necessarily hop on a call because they're 9 hours ahead to discuss anecdotally exactly what happened. It's good to be able to look at the data and see, okay, well, there's a drop-off that's greater at the on-site to offer stage or the TPS to on-site stage, and try to figure out and then have a conversation once you know there's a problem with the hiring manager to figure out what's going on. Another place where data is incredibly important is with diversity hiring. I think we all know that hiring for underrepresented talent and making sure we have a diverse workforce is incredibly important. But how do you make sure that you're spotting problems if there are? And it's really data. And if you have a candidate that's coming from an underrepresented background and they're going through the process and they're falling off in significantly higher rates than your average funnel data, it's a problem. And if you highlight the data to the hiring team, they're going to listen to you. Now, I think that in terms of data, just even if it's a little bit daunting, and I think sometimes people can get scared because maybe your ATS is a mess, but it really is worth it. And so the best place to start on cleaning things up is right now. Tip number 7. So just avoiding common mistakes. These are things that I've made mistakes on, and so I figured it might be helpful to share because it's okay if you make mistakes, but and they're going to happen. You just have to learn from them. So when you're working remotely, I think one of the key things to avoid is lack of communication. And so when in doubt, just over communicate. I'm constantly feeding information up, sideways, down. I over communicate on Slack. I over communicate in email because it just never harms anybody. If somebody says, oh, I already knew that, great, that's better. But they're going to be more upset if they feel that you haven't been keeping them in the loop. So when in doubt, just say it, over communicate it. Now, another thing that you can really avoid is having teams that just aren't familiar with your tools. So here's an example of something that I did recently where I would put all this beautiful time into making sure that my candidates the hiring team was prepped, they had context, they had clear idea of what to focus on, and they were in the calendar invites. But I forgot to train them that the content was in the calendar invites. Really simple. It would have taken me about maybe 5-10 minutes. And had I done that, it just would have been a better experience for them. So just take a few minutes and make sure that you're training the entire hiring team on the tools that you're using throughout the process. Now, another aspect is alignment. really easy to lose alignment, especially when you're not in the same office. And you really have to make that alignment happen. So with one of the founders I was working with, they had a role that was incredibly important to them, top priority, and we needed to move quickly on it. So I mistakenly assumed that they probably had looped in the entire hiring team and had told the rest of the hiring team what they were hiring for and why this role was important. Fortunately, I scheduled a kickoff meeting and got the entire team into a room together, and turned out that everybody was on a different page. And so fortunately, by doing that and making sure that we just took 30 minutes to align, make sure everybody was clear on the priorities, it saved us a ton of time down the line. This is a step that is easy to skip, especially when you're remote, but just don't do it. It will save you so much time if you just make sure it happens. Now, another aspect is hiring junior candidates. I think junior candidates are a great way to get awesome talent in the door, and they're hungry, they're scrappy, they've got great just energy in general. But when you are remote, junior candidates do on average require a bit more handholding. Usually they need a little bit more guidance in terms of expectation setting and holding themselves or being held accountable. Now, if you have junior candidates that you interview for this and they do well and they are great at holding themselves accountable, by all means, hire away. But just think about it first. Make sure you have a discussion with the hiring team around resourcing. Do we have the resources to actually set somebody up who's junior for success? And if you think about this beforehand, you'll avoid some potential hiring mistakes. Now, another aspect is documentation. Again, not super glamorous, but really important. I think one of our teams that does a really great job of this is Protocol Labs, and they actually started completely remote from the beginning. Everything, including all of their recruiting processes, are completely documented in GitHub, which is really interesting. It's an engineering culture, but it makes it so much easier for them to train and onboard new people, as well as have a clear documented process for everything that they're doing. So always worth the time just to make sure you document it so that it helps you scale. Now, the last thing that I'll say is, we're in a pandemic. This is a hard time to onboard new people. Not only are you trying to onboard with a new job and do the actual role, but you don't know anybody, which is kind of lonely. I feel like, coming on board where you have no connections and you've actually never met these people in person can be pretty daunting. And so I really emphasize the importance of creating a good onboarding plan for your new hires, setting up things like hiring buddies to make sure they have a touch point from somebody just to make sure they're doing okay and that can help them get integrated with the company. Also, making sure the hiring manager has set frequent communication, like a one-on-one scheduled on the calendar. Just making sure that you're planning not only to set them up for success in regards to the work, but also in terms of supporting them emotionally. With that said, that is all I've got. So we can move to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all those tips with us. We do have a good amount of questions for you. We can start with this first one. You've talked a lot about the challenges to overcome with remote work, but can you share any benefits that you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anybody who's used to hiring in the Bay Area knows how competitive and expensive it is to hire in San Francisco, Bay Area in general. And so one of the key areas that I love about the remote aspect is that there is so much talent all over the world. And the remote aspect opens up those channels of talent to us, and also is significantly cheaper for early stage startups that maybe don't have a ton of extra cash to spend, but they want to hire great talent. So I think that's a key element that is going to open up a lot of new opportunities for companies as they're growing.
Okay, awesome. And when you talk about this kind of talent that you're hiring remotely, do you think about any technical or cultural qualifications that you consider when you are hiring remotely?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think with technical qualifications, those should be pretty much standard. Well, actually, all of this should be pretty much standard, both technical as well as cultural, wherever you're hiring. But I think there are certain things that you can be careful to interview for. So obviously, I've talked about structured interviews and making sure that there's consistency and repeatability through the process. It's really important to do with both technical evaluation as well as cultural evaluation, and making sure that everybody's trained. Because even if you hire somebody who's on the other side of the world, if you've asked the question that you've asked the last 60 candidates and they perform better than everybody else, that they are technically going to be sound. Now, from a cultural standpoint, I'll circle back to the importance of being really structured in in how you ask these questions, and making sure that you clearly define what your values mean, and make sure that you have clear questions established to vet out if somebody is a cultural add or not. Now, another aspect to every company probably has different values or different culture, but being really intentional about what that means is very important. The culture is the glue that holds the company together, and I think people lean on the in-person interaction quite a bit in order to foster that glue. A lot of times when you talk to people, and you ask them what their favorite thing about a company is, they'll say, "Oh, the people," for sure. That's the case with me in almost every company I've ever worked for. But I think that when you are remote, that aspect is a little bit harder to pin down because you don't get to see people in person. And so being very intentional about hiring for those values ensures that as you are bringing people on from all over the world, you're being very consistent and, like I said, intentional around the types of people that you're bringing into the company, and not just relying on those in-person interactions to create your culture.
That's awesome. I definitely agree with you. People do make the company, and it's definitely an important thing to get the culture right there. So thank you for that. When it comes to the interview as well, you have the hiring manager, you have the other interviewers involved.
Mhm.
How do you think about, holding these folks accountable in terms of fulfilling their recruiting responsibilities?
It's a good question. So this is where you really need leadership endorsement. And we talked a bit around the recruiting team being partners rather than a service organization. And I think where I've seen this work best was when actually, I'll just give an example from Coinbase. We were hiring fairly early on, and Brian, the founder, would bring it up in team meetings at the end of each week about the importance of each hiring manager and, by proxy, the hiring team being responsible for their own hiring. And the recruiting team they were the facilitators. And we were definitely still responsible for helping to drive pipeline, managing a clean process, but candidates are always going to respond best to other engineers. And also, if you have people want to work with other great leaders. The engineer, if you're recruiting for engineers, are going to want to work with a manager that they respect. And so getting that hiring manager involved in the recruiting process is crucial. It saves so much time. And so I think that's actually, this is where I go back to data, right? The data is incredibly important, because if you can show time to hire and the differences in terms of drop off that you can have, as far as, if you hire somebody in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or a month, or longer potentially, those can have massive impacts. And if you have the hiring manager who's involved in the sales process and recruiting people, it shortens that time to hire significantly, because the candidate just becomes more engaged more quickly. So I use data, I leverage leadership to make sure that they understand what that data means, and then the messaging around that partnership is coming from the top. And another creative way that I've seen this happen is with including hiring targets in hiring managers' OKRs. That's definitely more unusual than I would say is the norm. But I think when it is there, it just sends that message that hiring is a responsibility of the managers on the teams, and includes them as part of the solution.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful, and really good insight into how you operate there. I believe that's all the time we have today. Aurora, thank you so much for being here with us. These are some amazing tips that you've been sharing with us. Audience, thank you all for joining us at the GEM Summit and participating here in this presentation. We'll see you again back in the general session. So have a great afternoon, and we will see you soon.
Thank you so much.